A poor girl gives blood to save a dying man and accidentally feeds the machine that destroys innocence. Isabella doesn't just rescue Lorenzo, she crosses the invisible border between mercy and violence. He believes he is protecting her, but in truth, his world infects hers the moment her name appears on the donor list. What begins as compassion becomes initiation. A quiet seamstress is forced to witness how power turns even blood into currency, and how men who speak of order often water hatred with the same hands that claim to save lives.
The weight of relentless poverty pressed on Isabella Moretti, making each decision a monumental task. At 24, she worked 2 jobs in Venice, yet still faced the nightly ceremony of tallying coins for food. Her mornings were spent in sanitation at a Santa Croce clinic. Her evenings tailoring garments for the wealthy who discarded opulence with ease. A perpetual ache lived in her body, the physical twin of a constant fear that one wrong move financially would shatter her precarious existence. The same fragility was mirrored in her Canorio flat, a third-floor space of seeping walls, loose window panes, and a fickle heater. Only her father's presence made the apartment a home. Giorgio Moretti, once the celebrated artisan tending the timepieces of Venice's upper crust, was now left half-blind by a stroke. His pride had curdled into a destructive poison, feeding his deep shame over their reversed roles, with Isabella as the lone breadwinner. They existed in an unspoken pact of shared illusion, where he pretended to accept his lot and she feigned control. Their delicate balance held them together daily. But this Thursday was different, strained by a late paycheck and a pharmacist denying credit for his medicine. Returning for something forgotten, Izzy stepped into the clinic and found organized mayhem. Medics maneuvered a gurney with the urgent precision of those who measure life in seconds. One nurse sprinted forward while another shouted for plasma. 3 men in dark suits flanked the patient, their formation more bodyguard than family. Izzy acted on pure instinct, pressing herself into the wall as the procession rushed by. Her eyes caught the shocking crimson that soaked through the patient's sheets. An oxygen mask hid much of his face, yet she could see the sharp angle of his jaw and a bruise darkening on his temple. The man on the gurney looked to be in his late 30s, powerfully built, his ruined clothes clearly expensive. He had the air of someone unused to being seen as non-threatening. Just as they passed the blood-draw room, his eyes snapped open. For Izzy, his stare felt like a physical touch. Though he was bleeding heavily and in obvious agony, conditions that should have caused confusion, his mind was sharp. His gaze swept the area in a swift, frigid inventory of the hall, the rooms, his guards, and the staff, finally settling on her. The look lasted only a second, but it was a calculated appraisal showing no trace of vulnerability before he was gone. The entourage swept him through the double doors, leaving the mixed smell of disinfectant and cordite in their wake. Izzy stood frozen, her heart hammering a primal rhythm of fear. A crisp voice from behind, a nurse, Paula, shattered her trance. Paula, normally a pillar of calm, was visibly frayed as she navigated donor files. "I need O negative," she stressed into her phone. "Not in the morning, right now." A knot formed deep in Izzy's gut. Her own blood type was O negative. She'd signed up 2 years ago, haunted by a neurologist's comment that a lack of blood could be a death sentence. The words had branded themselves onto her memory, so she had registered, seeing it as a way for someone with nothing to give something priceless. Paula hung up, her eyes landing instantly on Izzy. A moment passed before the nurse closed the distance between them. A quick volley of questions verified Izzy's status as an O negative donor. Izzy asked who the man was. Paula's tone dropped. "He has the sort of enemies who bring their wars into sterile rooms." She would say no more. Izzy faltered, mentioning she was tired and had not eaten since 6 a.m., hoping it would rule her out. What if I'm not eligible? Paula held her stare. By the time I locate another donor, he could be gone. Logically, who the patient was did not matter. Catastrophic blood loss is the great leveler, indifferent to wealth or station. Still, a strong reluctance rose in Izzy. It was not a wish for him to die. It was an instinct honed over years of watching men of his stature navigate their world, viewing people as mere tools for their own purposes. Her hesitation stemmed from a primal truth of the disenfranchised. Men who inspire terror seldom bring tranquility. But the final push came from a searing memory of her father in the stroke ward, enduring a 3-hour wait for blood he desperately needed. The recollection of praying for a simple IV bag like it was a sacred artifact vaporized any selfish impulse. "All right," she said softly. "Just show me where." 10 minutes passed and she found herself in the donor chair, holding a form whose words blurred. Another nurse eyed her slight frame, then looked to the man in the suit watching from the corridor, who remained silent. His silent watch was enough. The nurse readied the equipment. Izzy had always feared needles, but the strained, fabricated quiet of the room was a much deeper source of dread. It seemed they were all acting in a play about routine procedure. "Does he have any family here?" she asked, mostly to hear a voice. "It is better not to inquire," the nurse advised. Izzy absorbed that. "He is important, then." The nurse's continued silence was all the answer she needed. A tight band was wrapped around Izzy's bicep. She clenched her hand into a fist on command. The needle slid in. She flinched and turned her head, her eyes following the dark red path through the clear tube. Watching her own vitality drain away was profoundly unnerving, sharpening her sense of how tenuous her life was. Just a little more taken, and every burden, the money, the work, the lies, would dissolve into nothingness. She pictured the patient's fierce, authoritative gaze. He seemed to defy finality, as if he would command death itself to bend to his will. "Is he awake?" she asked. "In and out. Does he know who is giving blood?" The nurse gave her a strange look. "I imagine he is aware that efforts are being made to save him." Izzy's eyes drifted to the empty label on the medical tray. Driven by a sudden, unexamined urge, she grabbed a pen and scrawled 2 words in the corner in angled Italian script: "Non morire." The nurse noticed and started to speak, then stopped herself, placing the label on the bag in silence. Once it was over, Izzy felt dizzy and chilled. She drank the offered juice, waiting for the spinning to stop. The patient's guards were still posted in the hall. One accepted the bag of blood from the nurse with an almost ritualistic gravity and carried it toward the emergency bay. Izzy got to her feet, pressing a cotton ball to the crook of her arm. On her way out, she passed an alcove where a doctor was stripping off his gloves. He was addressing an older, silver-haired man in a dark overcoat. "We have controlled the hemorrhage temporarily," the doctor said. "But should another issue arise—" The man cut him off. "It will not." The physician looked drained. "Medicine does not operate that way." The man shifted, his profile sharp and refined, like carved granite. He was not the injured man. He had the air of a counselor, a man forged by a lifetime spent near the epicenter of influence. His eyes flickered over Izzy in a brief, detached appraisal, then returned to the physician. "Tonight," he declared, "medicine will do as it is told." The doctor's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Izzy slipped away before anyone could stop her, compelled by an urgent need to become invisible there. The chill of the evening air hit her skin like a slap. Venice was silent now, its pathways empty, the canals reflecting blackness. She drew her scarf closer, a small defensive gesture, and started home. The subject, Izzy, chose to walk rather than take transport, suggesting a reliance on physical activity to process distress. Her inner thoughts show a strategy of compartmentalization, reframing the donation as a purely charitable deed to shield against the traumatic experience. She reached her apartment past 1 a.m. Her father, Giorgio, was waiting, remarking on her lateness and the scent of antiseptic clinging to her. Her response was a silent gesture of placation. Initially, she was evasive, blaming her return time on work. Pressed further, she kept a composed exterior and acknowledged that a person had needed blood. Her father reacted with sudden alarm, deducing her part in the event and showing both anger and dread. To preempt his expected scolding about her own welfare, the subject made physical contact to soothe him, citing the man's dire state as her reason. His question of whether the patient lived induced a brief, stress-related flashback. The subject claimed to not know the result. She moved through the motions of cleaning, a familiar ritual to keep the dread at bay. A deep, persistent ache from the transfusion site was a physical echo of her constant, grinding poverty. Nothing had changed, yet a heavy premonition settled over her, a tightening in her chest that felt like a pre-scream. Sleep was a battleground of exhaustion and haunting images. The sterile light of the clinic, and the recipient's gaze, too sharp, too knowing, searing itself into her mind. Dawn found her still bone-weary. She moved with practiced silence, washing her face in the cold water, careful not to wake her father. Her mind clung to desperate bargains, a fantasy of impossible outcomes that might stave off financial ruin. She prayed for another 48 hours, for one more week of leniency, living a life patched together with threads of borrowed time. A sudden, deliberate series of 3 knocks broke the quiet rhythm of her work. She analyzed the sound instantly. It wasn't a neighbor or a friend. It was heavy with authority, with purpose, and it rooted her to the spot. No one she knew ever came to her door this way. The sound stirred her father, who often slept in his chair, a prisoner to his own pain. "Who is it?" her father asked, his voice a gravelly ruin of sleep. "I don't know," she managed to say, the words feeling foreign in her own mouth. The knocking came again, just as patient and firm. As she reached the door, her hand found the lock, and a jolt of ice went through her. It was wrong. Someone had changed it. A quiet invasion that made her skin crawl. A visceral coldness washed over her even before she turned the knob. The man on her doorstep was dressed as if he had fled in the night. His skin was unnervingly pale, the color of profound blood loss, and his face was a roadmap of dark bruises and a fresh, deep cut. She knew him instantly, not from a picture, but from the memory branded behind her eyes. It was his eyes that held her, steady, fiercely intelligent, and radiating an absolute dominance. A second man hovered in the background, his watchful stillness screaming of a bodyguard's duty. Izzy instinctively braced herself against the door, a fragile barrier demanding to know who they were. The first man considered her for a long moment before speaking his name. Lorenzo Raici. The name itself was a weapon, synonymous with fear and power in the city. His legitimate businesses were a thin veil for a much darker empire. His reputation was built on resolving problems outside the law. But it wasn't just his identity that terrified her. It was the timing. He was here, less than half a day after she'd given blood. "You can't be here," she whispered, and he agreed with a chilling lack of apology. When her father called her name, Lorenzo's attention shifted, his gaze turning sharp and analytical, utterly devoid of pity. "Let me in," Lorenzo requested, and Izzy's refusal was a sharp, reflexive snap. He took the rejection calmly, then revealed there had been a security failure at the clinic. Her private file had been sold. The words hung in the air before their terrible weight crushed her. With an unnerving placidity, Lorenzo listed the data they now had, his quiet tone amplifying the mortal danger he described. She shook her head in denial. "He isn't lying," the second man, Matteo Santoro, corrected her, his voice clipped and educated. He held out a piece of paper, a printout from the donor registry. Seeing her life itemized in black and white made her physically sick. When she asked who he was, Matteo replied, "Security," and the barest hint of a smile touched his lips before it vanished. Lorenzo flinched, a subtle tell of hidden pain. She saw at once that his injury was severe, then demanded to know about the lock. Lorenzo admitted to it, explaining he'd hired a locksmith at 6 a.m, fabricating a story about a fight with his girlfriend. The sheer audacity of the violation sent a spike of pure rage through her fear. He acknowledged he had no right, but claimed he had no time. Just then, her father got to his feet, demanding to know who they were. Lorenzo raised a placating hand before introducing himself. He put the situation to her father in blunt terms. His daughter saved his life, and now she is a target because of it. Fear bloomed on Giorgio's face instantly. At that moment, Izzy heard a new sound. Footsteps, multiple sets ascending the stairs. Matteo confirmed it. 3, maybe 4 hostiles. A cold dread seized her as Lorenzo demanded she make a choice now. The approaching footfalls tightened the vice of tension. Lorenzo laid out the possibilities like tarot cards of death. They abduct her, they take her father to use against her, or they simply kill them both to send a message. He pointedly refused to guess which was most likely, forcing her own imagination to do the horrific work. Her thoughts were fracturing. The bleeding man before her couldn't be the monster of legend, yet the threat felt terrifyingly real. His face was a mask of waxy pallor, with dark, bruised hollows beneath his eyes. He stood stiffly, one hand pressed to his side, betraying an agony he refused to show. He hadn't come with the expected army of 10 thugs and a fleet of black cars. His arrival, with a single guard and a fresh bandage stark against his collar, was a far more intimate and terrifying threat. The calculated quiet screamed of a personal crisis, a danger far greater than any brute force. The footsteps stopped on the landing outside. Matteo produced a small, silenced pistol, holding it ready with the calm of a surgeon. "We're out of time," he said flatly. The sight of the gun made Izzy's breath catch in her throat. Giorgio's protest, "No guns in my home," was a fragile plea for a world that no longer existed. Lorenzo turned his head slightly, his eyes fixed on her as he offered a way out. "Then let us leave it." The words ignited her defiance. "Leave?" she shot back. "Go where?" "A safe apartment near Giudecca, for now. Then we decide what comes next." "You mean what you decide?" His gaze hardened. "No, I am trying very hard not to." That confession of restraint unsettled her more than any command could have. A faint scratching noise came from the door, the sound of a tool probing the frame. Matteo shifted instantly, his weapon tracking the sound. Lorenzo's voice was low and urgent. "Izzy," she looked at him. "When you help a man like me," he said, "the wrong people notice. My being here is the only head start you have. It is the only advantage we have left." Another scratch, followed by a dead silence. Behind her, Giorgio whispered, "Bella, go!" She spun around. What? His blind eyes found the sound of her breathing. Do you think I don't understand? Men who move like that are not here to talk. If he's right, you have to go. Hot tears pricked her eyes. I'm not leaving you. You're not leaving him, Lorenzo cut in. You're taking him with you. Izzy froze. Lorenzo glanced at Matteo. Get the old man's coat? Before she could argue, Matteo was already moving, lifting Giorgio's heavy winter coat from the chair with a swift, practiced care that was neither gentle nor rough. It was the cold efficiency of a man who knew panic was a waste of precious seconds. Izzy stood rooted in the doorway. Lorenzo's voice dropped even lower. This is the last moment I can afford to be polite. A new sound came from the hall, sharp and final, the soft click of metal engaging the new lock. Her fear finally swallowed her anger whole. She backed away. Lorenzo stepped inside, and in that one motion, with her terrified father behind her, killers at the door, and Venice's most feared man claiming a blood debt she never meant to offer, Isabella Moretti understood that her life had just been rewritten. The world tilted the moment she opened that door. What followed was a blur, moving too fast for coherent thought. Matteo silently bolted the door behind Lorenzo, his eyes sweeping the apartment, instantly assessing its vulnerabilities. He took in the kitchen window, the short hall, the back door leading to a tiny service balcony over the canal. The flat was a death trap with no viable escape. Izzy saw the judgment on his face a second before he confirmed it. The front is compromised, he said quietly. Balcony, Giorgio said. He was pale but remarkably calm, asking no useless questions. He took the coat from Matteo, his hand fumbling with the sleeve for just a moment. Lorenzo saw it. Every sound found purchase in him. Though he had taken only 3 steps inside, the very air seemed to bend around his wounded, pale form, the small apartment contracting in his presence. He steadied himself against a chair, his breathing measured, his face a mask as he dissected the muffled sounds from the hallway. There was no alarm, no rush, just a profound stillness that showed Izzy why some men would die for him and others would kill him. Are those your people? She asked, her own voice a thin thread in the room. No. How do you know? Mine would have knocked. The words gave her no solace. A brittle scrape of metal echoed from beyond the door, then a curse swallowed by the wood. Matteo's gaze met Lorenzo's. They're using tools. A slow, deliberate nod was Lorenzo's only reply. We leave now. He started toward Giorgio, a gesture of aid, but the old man flinched away. Don't touch me. Lorenzo froze mid-step. As you wish. That such a powerful man would yield so completely sent a tremor of confusion through Izzy. Matteo was already at the back, his eyes tracing rusted iron staircase clinging to the wall. It should hold us, he said. Probably. The word hung in the air, and Izzy heard herself whisper it back. Matteo shot her a look. There's no time for guarantees. The noise at the front door grew louder, more violent. Giorgio's hand found her wrist. You first, he pleaded. No, Bella. As she turned, Lorenzo's voice cut through the tension. You'll go second, he commanded, his tone unnervingly level. Matteo, then your father. You are last. Izzy's eyes widened. And you? I will cover our departure. You can hardly stand. He met her stare, and in that instant, the force of his will finally silenced her protest. I can stand long enough. A splintering crack from the front door shattered the last of her fight. Matteo pulled the balcony door open, and the cold, wet breath of the canal rushed in. He moved onto the landing, testing the stair before turning to offer Giorgio a hand. For once, the proud old man did not refuse. With a patience that seemed out of place, Matteo guided the old man, a gloved hand firm beneath his elbow. Izzy followed, the frantic beat of her heart a drum against her ribs. The canal below was a chasm of black water hemmed in by stone. A lone boat drifted. Laundry lines sagged overhead, forgotten garments dancing like ghosts in the wind. On any other day, it was just a view. Now it was a place where people vanished. Behind them, the apartment door splintered open. A shout echoed. Lorenzo stepped out, pulling the balcony door shut and sliding the bolt home with his good hand. The bolt would not hold for long, but it only needed to buy seconds. He followed her down, his movements slower than Matteo's but just as precise, one hand gripping the rail, the other clamped to his side. Where the canal opened up, a small workboat waited, its white paint peeling anonymous, the kind that delivered linens or produce. At the tiller, a man in a knit cap smoked, his calmness that of one long past surprise. He eyed Lorenzo. "You look like you're already dead." "Not yet," Lorenzo replied. The boatman nodded at Giorgio. "He's coming too. Get in." Matteo helped Giorgio under the canvas tarp. Izzy scrambled in after, legs shaking, clutching a bag to her chest. Lorenzo was the last one aboard, and as he swung himself in, Izzy saw it, the flicker of agony as his jaw tightened and the color drained from his face. It was gone in a breath, but she saw the man beneath the iron will. The engine thrummed to life just as shouts spilled from the alleyway. Izzy ducked instinctively, hidden by the tarp. They moved through the water with the steady, ignorable rhythm of a delivery boat as Matteo stood guard, watching the water churn behind them. Giorgio sat like a statue, one hand gripping his cane, the other a fist. Izzy found herself staring at Lorenzo across from them. He was braced against the hull, as if needing the support. Up close, his wound seemed worse. His skin was ashen, a sheen of sweat on his throat, and a dark patch bloomed on his shirt where the bleeding had resumed. He felt her eyes on him. "Say it," she started. "What?" "Whatever you've been thinking since I walked through your door." The fear inside her sharpened into a blade of anger. "Fine. You had no right to come into my life, to frighten my father, and to drag us from our home like criminals." "No," he said, his calm absolute. "I had a duty." "To who?" "To the woman who kept me from dying on a hospital floor." Izzy's lips pressed into a thin line. "That was anonymous. I gave blood to a stranger." His eyes never left hers. "I know." "Then stop acting like I signed up for some blood debt in your world." "I know that too." She almost laughed from sheer frustration. "Do you? Because it certainly looks like your world has swallowed mine whole." Before he could answer, Giorgio spoke. "Who are they?" Lorenzo turned his unnerving gaze to the old man. "I don't know yet." From the front of the boat, Matteo spoke without looking back. "That means he knows enough to be worried." Isabella watched them, a knot tightening in her stomach. "That's not very comforting," she managed. Matteo's reply was curt. "It's not supposed to be." Lorenzo addressed Giorgio, his voice low as he laid out the grim truth. The attack at the hospital was a test, he explained, to see if he'd lived. From there, they bought the donor list. "Hospitals just sell names like that?" Isabella asked, incredulous. Lorenzo corrected her. "Records exist, and anything that exists can be bought." When she asked why, his answer chilled her. In his world, everything and everyone was a tool to be used. As her father began to protest, Lorenzo cut him off, his voice a quiet finality. "That is precisely why you are on this boat." His words silenced them. As the boat chugged through the waterways, Isabella felt trapped in a nightmare, her eyes scanning every shadow, her body braced for an attack that never came. The city drifted by, indifferent. Tourists laughed on bridges, vendors sold flowers, a world completely unaware that hers had just ended. The serene beauty of it all made the terror feel even more isolating. After what felt like an eternity, but was only 20 minutes, the boat slowed beside a crumbling building on Judica, chosen, she knew, for the way it could disappear. The building looked abandoned, with cracked plaster and splintered green shutters. Matteo swept through it first, a phantom in the shadows, before waving them inside. The air was stale with the smell of dust and decay, a forgotten warehouse. But the apartment within was jarringly clean, empty, and impersonal. There was no art, no books, nothing to suggest a life had ever been lived there. It was a room designed to hold people, not to be a home. Matteo's voice broke the silence, laying down the rules of their new prison. "How long are we staying here?" Isabella demanded. The answer depended on whether this was a warning, a kidnapping attempt, or something more. Lorenzo's face was drawn with a pain he fought to hide, a display of control that was itself a kind of threat. Both she and Matteo saw his weakness. When Matteo suggested tending to the wound, Lorenzo ignored him, turning to Giorgio instead, offering small comforts only if the old man took his medicine. Giorgio's refusal was a last stand of defiance. Matteo sighed. "Try not to make this impossible." Realizing the futility of it, Giorgio fell silent and told Isabella to do as they said. After he'd gone to the other room, she turned on Lorenzo, demanding the real story. A ghost of a smile, cold and without humor, touched Lorenzo's lips. "I've told you the truth." She knew it was a lie, or at least a version of the truth crafted to manage her. A flicker in Matteo's expression confirmed it, earning him a sharp glance from Lorenzo. Then, to end the argument, Lorenzo produced a folded paper, a new weapon in this war of wills. It was the donor list, filled with photos and scribbled notes. Lorenzo explained it with chilling calm. A source inside the hospital sold 3 names. Her name was on the list. She stared at the paper. 3. The other 2, he said, were merely bait to see which one the enemy would choose. They chose her. A cold dread washed through her. When she asked why, Lorenzo paused, letting the weight of the moment settle before delivering the final blow. "Because they found out I asked for your name." The fact that he had sought her out was somehow more terrifying than the threat itself. "You asked," she whispered. "Yes." Her question, "Why?" caused something to shudder behind Lorenzo's eyes. He revealed the nurse's report, a phrase written on the blood bag. She froze. With a chilling stillness, he spoke the words, "Non morire." A flush of shame crept up her neck. Her own thought, "That was stupid," was countered by his gentle reframing. It was human, a calculated move to build trust through shared frailty. Matteo cut in, his eyes fixed on Lorenzo's injury. Lorenzo straightened instantly, a hard shell of pride, which Matteo met with a cool, dissecting gaze. Lorenzo laid out a series of commands meant to corner her, her sharp defiance. "And if I refuse?" was met with his calm certainty, "You won't." He then pointed to the mark on her arm, weaving her sacrifice into the fabric of their crisis, elevating it beyond mere fright. Before she could react, his composure fractured for a second. It was a fleeting glimpse of weakness that without Mateo's swift, steadying hand, she might have entirely missed. Mateo's hand offered support. A flare of anger ignited in Lorenzo's eyes, not from the pain, but from the shame of being seen. Isabella stood, a statue. In that moment, the colossus of Lorenzo crumbled in her mind. The stark fact of his mortality, that he had bled for her, was a deeper shock than any weapon. Her fear evolved from simple terror into a tangled knot of feeling, the genesis of a traumatic bond. For the next hour, they retreated into ritual, Mateo's voice a low murmur on secure lines. Giorgio a silent, watchful guardian. Isabella's hands moved aimlessly at the kitchen counter. Lorenzo reappeared, the strain of his body still a visible weight upon him. She heard herself voice concern, suggesting a hospital, a textbook transference of empathy onto her captor. He turned the notion of sanctuary into a threat. The hospital is the reason we are here. Her logic was dismissed by his dark conclusion. It makes the doctors untrustworthy. He cemented himself as her only truth. Then he sank into a chair, his body forcing a retreat. She read his surrender to the chair, not as an invitation, but as an end to the performance. Mateo's glance signaled a change in tactics. The truth, with fewer omissions, was now required. Isabella steeled herself, her voice firm against any further games. Lorenzo's gaze settled on her, heavy with the manufactured weariness. The performance of a ruler's burden, more binding than any open aggression. He began his account. 3 nights ago, one of his company's refrigerated trucks simply vanished. The truck's manifest claimed ordinary medical supplies. A lie, she sensed it immediately. In answer, Mateo slid a file across the table, filled with manifests and grainy photos. Lorenzo admitted he first wrote it off as a common theft, but the details revealed a more sinister design. The truck was purposefully rerouted, its cargo swapped, and then returned to the system under a blanket of forged papers. The chilling facts settled in her mind. "So they used one of your trucks?" she distilled. Lorenzo's correction was sharp. "One of my legitimate trucks." A line drawn in his personal code. Her disbelief was met by his flat statement. "For me." It was a glimpse into a mind where sins were neatly filed away. When she asked what it really carried, his voice grew colder. He listed counterfeit blood thinners and black market transport coolers, painting a picture of a system corrupted long before he touched it. The conspiracy ran deep, with tendrils in purchasing, transit, and hospitals. She gave the horror a name: fake medicine. Lorenzo agreed, adding the likelihood of stolen blood. The weight of it, people die from that, made even Giorgio flinch. Lorenzo's quiet. "Yes," was a sterile confirmation, the body count. She saw his place in the puzzle. "And you found out," he amended. "I found enough to be a problem." The shooting was a consequence, he hinted, but not the only one. The group also mined donor lists, hunting for rare blood types to exploit later. A crease of revulsion formed between her brows. When she asked why, Mateo gave cold logic of commerce. What is rare is valuable. Izzy stated they were treating human blood like a stock, and Lorenzo's face remained a mask. In some circles, he affirmed, that is exactly what it is. A wave of sickness washed over her. "I knew pieces of this world existed, but I never imagined it had crept into the hospitals until 3 days ago. Now what I know is enough to get me killed in a loading dock at 2 a.m. She slammed the file shut, the sound a crack in the room's tense silence. "And my donation put me in the middle of it." "You were drafted," he corrected. a careful twist of her reality. That changes nothing. It changes your degree of guilt. A harsh hiss of air left Izzy's lungs. Don't do that. His eyes narrowed with clinical curiosity. Do what? Speak to me like you can absolve a crime with a well-timed, perfectly spoken sentence. A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even respect, crossed his face. I'm not trying to win you over, he said. No, her voice cracked and climbed. You broke into my home, you took me from my life, you terrified my father. Now we're here, and you tell me my own blood might have signed me up for a criminal enterprise. That sounds exactly like a man trying to manage the emotions in this room. Mateo shot a look at the ceiling, a silent appeal to a higher power. Lorenzo, however, was a statue, offering only a slow, deliberate nod. A fair assessment, he conceded. His calm agreement took the wind from her sails. Before she could regroup, he spoke. Control is my nature. An apology would be a lie. I am giving you the truth now because a lie would make you run or fight. I can survive one of those. I'm not sure you can. The threat was chilling for its sheer practicality. Izzy's eyes returned to the file. A photo was paper-clipped to the back, half tucked away. She pulled it free and her spine went rigid. It showed a loading bay, 2 figures shifting crates from a truck. A damaged corner on one crate exposed smaller cases inside, each marked with a strange gold crest. Then it hit her, a lion with the crown. Her heart began to race. What is it? Mateo asked. Izzy's fingers tightened at the picture. I've seen this symbol. Lorenzo's attention sharpened to a fine point. Where? She swallowed hard. At the workshop. Mateo frowned. The costume shop? Yes. Lorenzo leaned in, the movement slight, but it held the coiled tension of a predator. Explain. Now. Izzy's gaze was fixed on the lion. One of Bellini's private clients uses trunks with that crest. Not for gowns, but for masks and jewels. Things too private for the staff to see. They are always delivered by the same service. Dark vans, silent drivers, heavy locks. The client, I don't know his real name. She searched her memory. Bellini just calls him Continue, because he never smiles and always wears black gloves. He commissions pieces for private parties, masked balls. Sometimes he rents out entire collections. In that instant, a look passed between Mateo and Lorenzo, a story told and understood in a flash. You know who he is, she accused. Lorenzo's voice was flat. I am aware of him, which means yes. It means he operates through charities and shell companies, Mateo added. Galas, hospital fundraisers, church donations, all perfectly clean on the surface. Izzy stared at the photo, the new information slotting into place. He was at the workshop this Monday. You're certain? Yes. How do you remember Monday so clearly? Because that's the day Bellini told me not to look at the client when he walked in. A grim, humorless smile touched Lorenzo's mouth. And did you listen? Of course. For the first time, a genuine hint of amusement broke through Mateo's composure. Izzy ignored him, pushing on. Bellini had me in the back room, sewing beads onto a silver mask. The client was in the front on his phone. He sounded angry. He kept saying the word donors. I thought he meant people giving money to a charity. The rich talk like that. But now... Her eyes fell back to the picture. Now I don't think he was talking about money at all. A heavy silence fell over the room. Lorenzo stood with a suddenness that betrayed him, his hand gripping the table to steady a dizzy spell. But Izzy saw it, and so did Mateo. Sit down, she commanded, the words out of her mouth before she could stop them. Lorenzo's gaze fell upon her. Sit, she insisted, her tone allowing no argument. "You are not authorized to collapse during a debriefing." The corner of Matteo's mouth twitched. To her shock, Lorenzo obeyed, lowering himself into a chair. The simple movement felt heavy with meaning. He laced his fingers together, his stare so intense it made her wish she could take back her bold, unsafe words. "Monday," he commanded, his voice low, "recount everything." And she did. The trunk, the insignia, Bellini's frantic energy, the client in black gloves, and the sentence that had seemed like nonsense. Keep the clean list separate from the public list. Before she had even finished, Matteo was already writing. For several heartbeats, Lorenzo was a statue. "That," he said finally, "is the first significant break we have had since the shooting." Izzy stared. "Because of me? Because you were watching when anyone else would have looked away." She broke his gaze first. From the bedroom, the single tap of Georgia's cane on the hardwood floor echoed. "Bella," he said, his voice weary but sharp. "If your work is tied to these people, you cannot return there. I'm aware. And if his enemies have this address, the apartment is no longer secure." She knew that too, but hearing it spoken aloud made the danger feel real. Lorenzo rose more carefully this time. "You will not go back there alone." "That sounds like an order." "It is." She readied an objection, but the vibration of Matteo's secure phone silenced the room. All three of them froze. He glanced at the screen, answered, listened for 10 seconds, then his eyes met Lorenzo's. "The nurse from the donation room has vanished," he reported. "She left the hospital 30 minutes after the procedure." "She never made it home." Izzy felt the blood drain from her face. "Nurse Marcia," she whispered. Matteo confirmed with a sharp nod. Lorenzo's eyes closed for a fraction of a second. When they opened, any small warmth they had gained was gone. They moved faster than I anticipated. Izzy's hand found the back of a chair, gripping it for balance. "Because of me." Lorenzo's eyes locked onto hers. "Because you are no longer the only witness." And just like that, the nature of things shifted. This was no longer an extraction, a warning, or a deal between a poor woman and a dying man. It had become a hunt with a clear trail, and she was on it. Izzy hadn't realized how deeply she had prayed for Nurse Marcia's irrelevance, a tired professional doing her job at the wrong time. She had built that story because the alternative was monstrous. The alternative meant Marcia saw something or helped someone and was now erased for it. "What do you mean, gone?" Izzy demanded. Matteo ended the call, slipping the phone into his pocket. Her shift ended at 7. She signed out. Video shows her leaving by the staff exit. After that, she's gone. "Gone," Giorgio echoed from the doorway. "People do not just become gone." "In cities like this, they do," Lorenzo replied quietly. Izzy hated his tone, not callous, but weary, like a man who had seen it too many times. "Then we find her." Matteo looked at her. "That is the mission." "No," she countered. "Not your mission, mine. You keep talking about files and witnesses as if you're the only two people in this room with any say. That is because we are the ones trained for this." "And I am the one who knows the workshop," she shot back. "I saw the crest. I heard the client say donors. And if Marcia vanished because of what she saw that night, I will not sit by while you two decide which parts of my own life I'm allowed to be a part of." A heavy silence fell. Matteo glanced at Lorenzo, but Lorenzo's eyes remained fixed on her. He didn't raise his voice. He rarely seemed to need to. You want to contribute? He asked. Yes. Then understand something. Contributing doesn't mean winning. It doesn't mean being brave. It doesn't even mean being useful all the time. Sometimes contributing is about listening when every nerve tells you to move. Izzy held his stare. And sometimes listening is just a prettier word for obeying. An unreadable expression crossed his features. He gave a single, slow nod. Yes, sometimes it is. His admission shouldn't have made him easier to trust, but somehow it did. Matteo put the folder on the table. Bellini opens at 10. Private clients arrive after noon. If the man in the gloves is involved, the shop is one of several possible fronts for exchanges. Luxury businesses work well for that. Rich patrons, odd billing, and delivery schedules nobody questions. Izzy's perspective of her workplace began to shift. The locked back room, the secret fittings, the sealed containers she was never to touch. Details that once signaled wealth now looked like clues. Matteo theorized that Bellini wasn't a criminal himself, but that his shop was being used. Giorgio came to the table, his worry plain. "My daughter will not go back there alone," he declared. Matteo confirmed that sending her alone was not the plan. A muscle in Lorenzo's jaw tightened. No. The single word was absolute. Izzy challenged him, but he countered that returning to the workshop was no longer her choice, not since its connection to the men in her apartment was clear. She argued back, "Take me out, and you lose your only way inside without causing suspicion." Lorenzo seemed conflicted, acknowledging her logic while hating the risk it entailed. "Your cover is worthless if they know who you are," he stated. "Only if Bellini knows," she replied, offering no plan if he did. Before they reached a stalemate, Matteo offered another tactic. "Bellini trusts you," he began, "so call him. Fake an illness. He'll complain. Then claim you forgot something to see if you can get access after hours." Izzy knew her boss. "He despises interruptions after 6 o'clock. If there's a private client, he won't let me in." That denial would be intelligence in itself, Matteo noted. Lorenzo shifted his stance, a controlled motion that betrayed the pain in his side. He gave the order. "Make the call." "Now?" Izzy's question hung in the air. "Now." She pulled out her phone but paused, looking at Matteo. "You told me not to use this for outside calls." He pushed a small signal-blocking pouch toward her. "Put your device inside." She complied, dialing Bellini's number by heart. He answered, and the fourth ring, his voice already sharp with irritation. "Isabella, are you aware it is nearly 10? You are late." She took a steadying breath. "I am not coming in to work this morning." A beat of stunned silence answered her. Bellini stammered. "You are not what?" "I'm unwell." "You were perfectly fine the last time I saw you." "My situation has changed." "You can be ill on your own schedule, Isabella. The Lombardi order is waiting." "I was at a hospital last night donating blood," she interjected, her tone pitched with just enough exhaustion to sell the lie. "They called me in for an emergency. The walk home, I almost fainted." This got his attention, not through sympathy, but through alarm. "You gave blood without asking me. Are you insane? Your hands tremble if you miss a meal. You thought bleeding would improve things?" Izzy glanced over at Lorenzo, whose face had become an unreadable mask. "It wasn't planned," she said. A sharp exhale crackled over the line. "Fine, stay home today. But if you are absent tomorrow, you are off the belladonna fittings." Before he could disconnect, she slid the probe in. "Did Continro stop by this morning?" The silence on the line was suddenly electric. Bellini's voice, when it returned, was falsely light. "Why do you ask?" "No reason. I left my silver thimble Sabak workroom. I thought if he was there, I would wait to come by." "That won't be necessary," Bellini said far too quickly. "There are no clients right now." Izzy felt the focus of both Matteo and Lorenzo sharpen on her. "Are you certain?" she pressed. "Because I can grab it after lunch if—" "No!" Bellini's tone became ice. "You said you were ill." "Be a convincing invalid, Isabella. We'll speak tomorrow." The line went dead. Izzy lowered the phone, her movement deliberate. "He's lying," Matteo said. "Yes. What told you?" "He never calls private patrons clients to his people. They're monsters, vultures, parasites, whatever fits his mood." Using that word meant he was being overheard. Lorenzo's gaze hardened, and mentioning continuo made him shield something. "He was afraid," Matteo countered. Izzy's stare fixed on him. "The two are not always the same." "No," Lorenzo conceded. "But in this instance, it's a meaningless distinction." He produced the file, opening it to a photograph of the crowned lion beside a blank leaf. His eyes stayed locked on the image as he gave Matteo his instructions. "Comb through 6 months of customs records and event hires tied to Bellini's workshop. I want medical charities, specifically. If he's using galas for cover, his supply chain will show a rhythm." Matteo was already at the secure comms unit. Izzy got to her feet. "And me?" Lorenzo finally looked at her. "You will be a target." The order bristled against her. "That sounds remarkably like doing nothing." "It means you answer if Bellini calls, reply to any text from the workshop in character, and report any memory you recover to me instantly. And if I need you on the ground, you will enter and exit precisely on my word. You have a deep-seated need for control." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, one that borders on pathological. Before a reply could form on her lips, Matteo called from the doorway. "There's more." He came back with his tablet. The screen showed a still from a service corridor in the hospital, marked with an early morning timestamp. Nurse Marga stood near an exit door, bag on her shoulder, her head tilted towards someone unseen. Her face was tight with tension but showed no fear. Then a detail registered in Izzy's mind and a cold sickness washed through her. Marga was holding the sleeve of a silver gown with a hand-stitched cuff. It was Bellini's work. "No," Izzy whispered. Matteo's eyes lifted from the tablet to her face. "You recognize it? That gown is from the Belladonna collection. I finished that cuff yesterday." The life went out of her voice. "So she was meeting someone from the workshop." "Or an associate of the workshop," Lorenzo amended. Izzy stared at the screen. "Why does Marga have it?" Gio offered an answer none of them had considered. "Because someone gave it to her." They all turned to look at him. The old man made a small gesture. "You people with money see webs everywhere. Sometimes the machinery is plain. A gift, a sign, a silent order telling her the next move." Izzy studied the image again, and suddenly he was right. It wasn't a random garment or stolen goods, it was a guidepost. "They're leading her," she said, the realization spoken aloud. Lorenzo's attention became absolute. "To what location?" Her thoughts accelerated, memory finally overpowering the dread. She saw racks of half-finished dresses, discreet appointment books, shipping manifests. Bellini's whining about a client who demanded a secret show with candles and a private dock. "The San Petro warehouse," she announced. Matteo's head snapped up. "What's that?" "An old receiving warehouse near the church docks." Bellini used it a couple of times during Carnival for patrons demanding off-site fittings. No sign in the building, just a side door and a loading dock right on the canal. To meet a nurse in secret, avoiding the main canals, a spot known for costume shipments would be ideal, Weiss Matteo deduced. Lorenzo was on his feet so fast the chair shrieked across the floor. This time the agony was written on his face. His hand flew to his side, his composure cracking for an instant before the mask fell back into place. Izzy stepped forward on pure reflex. "You can't go anywhere like that!" His eyes burned into hers. "And yet I have to." "No." The word came out with more force than she meant, and with more intimacy. Something shifted in his eyes for a fraction of a moment. It wasn't kindness. It was recognition. Matteo spoke softly. "If she's right, there's a chance Marga is still an asset." That single sentence ended all debate. Lorenzo reached for his coat. "Then we go immediately." Izzy was already pulling on her coat. He caught the motion and said, "You're not part of this." She looked straight at him. "You'll have to make me stay." For the first time, Lorenzo Ricci seemed less like a commander issuing an order and more like a man facing an inconvenient fact. The woman who had saved his life with her blood was not psychologically capable of being a bystander. That reality was going to create problems. Their argument lasted less than 60 seconds. There was no time for more. "You are not coming," Lorenzo said again, taking the pistol Matteo had set on the credenza. Izzy finished with her coat. "Then put me down now, because it's the only way." Matteo let out a low sound of what could only be admiration. Lorenzo pivoted to face her fully. "You think stubbornness is your best weapon?" "No," she answered. "Memory is. I know Bellini's habits. I know that building. I can spot the difference between a client meeting and a hostage exchange. You two are walking into a snare, made of things I recognize and you don't." He seemed about to refuse again. Then Gio's voice came from the chair. "Take her with you." All three turned. The old man's chin was raised, his sightless gaze aimed in Lorenzo's direction. "I do not like you. I may never. But if my daughter stays here while her thoughts are out there, I will have to listen to her breathe like a creature in a cage. It is better she is useful over there than caged in here, imagining every possible disaster." "That's not the most fatherly thing I've ever heard," Matteo remarked. "It is practical," Gio retorted. Lorenzo held Izzy's stare for a beat longer, then gave a sharp, decisive nod. "You stay between me and Matteo. If either of us gives an order, you obey it instantly. I say down, you drop. Matteo says run, you're already moving." Izzy's hand edged toward the drawer where Giorgio kept a small paring knife. Matteo caught the motion and let out a weary breath. "I'd rethink that." She glanced at him. "Why?" "Because if this night ends badly, that little blade is just going to add to my list of regrets." Before she could respond, the encrypted phone chimed. After a brief, quiet exchange, Matteo hung up and looked to Lorenzo. "Reva's ETA is 10 minutes. Izzy asked who Reva was. "A doctor," Lorenzo answered, "and on a very short list of people I trust to keep their mouths shut." Dr. Reva appeared in less than the time promised. A woman in her 40s with a pragmatic face and dark hair tied back. She carried a medical kit. She took in the room without reaction. A frightened woman, a blind man, a wounded mob chief, and a bodyguard inside a run-down Giudecca apartment. She inspected Lorenzo's side in the kitchen, her movements efficient, suggesting she was long past judging her patients. "The stitches have torn," she stated flatly. "I'm aware." "Being aware doesn't fix it." "I'm not trying to fix it." "No," she replied, noting the red stain spreading under the dressing. "You're trying to save your own life while behaving like you want to die." Izzy might have found it amusing if the tension wasn't thick enough to choke on. Dr. Reva cleaned and redressed the wound with practiced speed, put a spare bandage in Lorenzo's coat, then focused on Izzy. If his skin goes gray, make him sit. If he tells you he's fine, he is lying. If the bleeding starts again, you apply pressure here. She touched a specific point below his ribs. Hard. Izzy nodded before the weight of the command fully registered. Rava then checked Giorgio's pressure, tweaked his prescription, and told him that leaving the flat was not an option. The old man put up a token fight for pride's sake before conceding. He had already accomplished his goal of sending Izzy with them. 5 minutes later, they were on the water. The journey to the San Pedro warehouse was short in a private launch, shorter still for a pilot who knew which back canals to take. Matteo drove this time, guiding the low-slung black boat with a single hand while his eyes swept for any danger. Lorenzo was seated near the prow, his dark coat pulled tight, facing into the wind as if the bite of the cold was a welcome distraction from his own thoughts. Izzy sat opposite him, saying nothing, having judged her own chaotic mind to be unhelpful. It was Lorenzo who broke the silence. "Bellini," he said, "give me your assessment of his loyalty." Money was a promise. Danger was not a factor. He would break under pressure. He would yield to a look. A ghost of a smile crossed Matteo's face. Lorenzo offered a single sharp nod. Done. Izzy watched him. "You use fear like a language. It is one, and you are a master of it." His eyes met hers, shadowed and spent, yet unnervingly calm. "I grew up speaking it." She was the first to look away. By the time their boat slid into its berth behind the warehouses, the city had settled into its mid-morning hum. Business, labor, the chime of bells, the ordinary pulse of life that so often conceals a darker heart. The San Petro warehouse stood a half block from the water, its brickwork anonymous, with 2 shuttered eyes on the upper floor and a wide loading door scarred by time and rust. Izzy had been inside the warehouse only twice, both times during the frenzy of Carnival, when Bellini needed a vast, private space for clients who craved discretion as much as spectacle. She knew the front layout by heart. The welcome area, the partitions for changing, the endless racks of costumes, and the small office in the back with its broken lock. More importantly, she remembered a side door down a tight alleyway, the one Bellini used to move delicate merchandise away from the prying eyes of delivery men. She led them straight to it. The alley smelled of dampness and old stone. At its end stood a steel door, painted the same forgettable gray as the wall. And as expected, it was locked. Matteo dropped into a crouch, his fingers exploring the doorframe before his gaze traveled up. Alarm wires are cut, and it's recent. They wanted it sealed, not monitored, Izzy thought. Lorenzo stepped closer, his body heat a small furnace in the cold air. "How certain are you that Margia is inside?" "I'm not at all," she admitted. "But the Belladonna sleeve was Bellini's signal, and this is where he conducts his private affairs. It's the only place to start." "That's an honest answer," he noted, just before a sound bled through the metal. A woman's cough, quiet, not for show, but it was enough. A single knowing glance passed between Matteo and Lorenzo. Then, with a series of clicks, Matteo defeated the lock. The air inside the warehouse was colder than the alley, heavy and dim. "She's in here." "I know," Lorenzo answered. "That doesn't make this clean." Matteo moved past the first row of costumes, weapon held low and ready. His eyes swept the dark corners, the floor, the partitions, and the grated walkway overhead. Lorenzo let go of Izzy's wrist, only to push her behind him. She despised the gesture, and she despised her own instinct to obey even more. In the center of the vast room, partly hidden by a trio of rolling mirrors, they found Nurse Marja bound to a chair. Her mouth was clear, but rope bit into her wrists, and a dark bruise stained the side of her face. The silver belladonna sleeve lay on the concrete near her feet, like a fallen banner. Her eyes went wide when she saw Izzy. "You shouldn't have come," she breathed. "That," a voice echoed from the shadows beyond the racks, "is the first intelligent thing I've heard all day." Bellini stepped into the dim light, and for a confusing second, Izzy almost felt relieved. But then she saw his face. He was drowning in terror, not guilt, not defiance, pure terror. His fine scarf was missing, his shirt was open at the throat. One of his hands trembled so violently that he had to seize it with the other. Behind him, another figure materialized from the gloom. A tall man in a black coat and dark gloves. It was Continuo, now without his mask. He was older than Izzy had guessed, maybe in his late 40s, with a touch of silver at his temples and the easy authority of a man used to rooms quieting when he entered. She recognized him from a press photo Bellini kept, a story about his funding of a church restoration. Adriano Vieri. The flash of recognition in her eyes made his lips curve into a slight smile. "Miss Moretti," he said. "What a pity that brilliance and poverty are so often found together. It makes survival a complicated affair." A small, broken noise escaped Bellini. "I told them not to involve her." Vieri didn't even look his way. "You told them many things. That is precisely why your usefulness is expiring." Matteo's pistol was already raised, but it was useless. Two other men appeared on the high catwalk, both armed, both holding the high ground. A trap. The realization hit Izzy a moment before the word formed. Lorenzo, however, stood his ground. "You've acquired a taste for theatrics, Adriano." Vieri smiled. "And you, Enzo, have acquired a conscience." The name sounded different from his lips. Enzo, a name used by those who knew Lorenzo Ricci well enough to love him, or hated him well enough to twist the knife. Vieri gestured toward Marja. "Your nurse saw too much. Your donor remembered things he shouldn't. And now here we all are, wasting a perfectly fine day in a place that smells of mothballs." "You were stealing from hospital supply lines," Lorenzo stated flatly. Vieri gave a tiny shrug. "Supply lines, donor lists, quiet arrangements. The wealthy have always known a simple truth the poor cannot afford. Life can be purchased, extended, or saved if you have enough money. I merely provided a structured market." A wave of sickness washed over Izzy. "You mean you were a broker for blood?" "I sold access," he corrected smoothly. "To blood types, to tissue matches, to donor locations, to the top of the list. The sums people will pay when an heir is dying or a public figure needs a discreet transplant are simply breathtaking." Bellini made another sound, something between a whimper and a protest. "I only rented him the space. I didn't know about the rest of it." The warmth left Vieri's smile. "You knew enough to doctor the invoices." Lorenzo's voice grew quiet. "You tried to kill me over invoices." "No," Vieri said softly. "I tried to kill you because you started asking where the real donor list was being kept." A heavy silence fell over the warehouse. Then Marja, bruised and shaking in the chair, said, "It's tonight." Every eye snapped to her. Vieri's composure finally fractured. Marja looked at Lorenzo, her gaze bypassing Izzy. The transfer, the main one. The masks, the donors, the secret pledges. Belladonna Hall, at midnight. They're using the foundation ball as cover. Izzy's breath caught. Belladonna Hall was Bellini's biggest contract of the season. A private masquerade fundraiser in an old palazzo, all for art and charity. The city's elite, all in costume. Masks mandatory, identities hidden. A perfect screen for illicit business. Vieri sighed with exaggerated sadness. You see, this is what makes loose ends so very tiresome. His hand moved. So did Matteo's. The first gunshot shattered a mirror into a spiderweb of glass. The warehouse exploded. Matteo fired upwards at the catwalk. Lorenzo shoved Izzy down behind a rack of clothes. As her knees hit the concrete, he spun, drew his own weapon, and fired twice into the corner where Vieri had stood. Marja screamed. Bellini hit the floor as the world erupted. Glass from a second mirror rained down as bullets tore through hanging garments. A ringing tone hammered Izzy's ears, blurring the sounds of the fight. Lorenzo was a physical shield over her, his arm braced on the rack to keep him steady. Stay down! You're putting weight on your wound, not the time! Marja cried out again. Izzy saw one of the gunmen fall to Matteo's aim, but the second was still firing. Bellini was scrambling for cover. Vieri had vanished behind a set of large trunks. We can't leave her, she shouted. A sudden bond forged in chaos. The muscle in Lorenzo's jaw tightened. It was the acceptance in his voice, the sound of a weight already carried, that finally cracked her resolve. He fired his weapon again, then his eyes found hers. When I move, you get to Marja. Cut her free. Matteo has the catwalk. Don't be a hero. You free her, then you get behind me. Got it? Izzy swallowed, her throat suddenly dry, and nodded. Understood. He moved before her fear could take root. 2 shots, then a curse from behind the trunks. She heard Matteo shout from above. Lorenzo created a window of opportunity, and Izzy ran. When she reached Marzia, the nurse was frozen in a state of silent, terrified shock. Izzy fumbled for the small knife Matteo had dismissed as useless, and with shaking hands sliced through the ropes at Marja's wrists. They fell away. Marja sagged against her, her strength gone. They have the guest masks, Marja whispered, her voice urgent. The numbered ones. The donor list is in the black ledger. Where is it? Marzia began to lift a hand just as another gunshot cracked the air. Lorenzo twisted, taking the bullet in his shoulder instead of his chest. He stumbled, a slight but telling falter. Izzy reacted on pure instinct, catching his arm to steady him, her other hand feeling the instant, spreading warmth of blood soaking his jacket. Pain vanished from his face, replaced by a cold architecture of fury. Enzo! Matteo's voice tore through the room, raw and stripped of protocol. The man named Enzo swept his gaze over Izzy's bloodless features, then snapped it toward the shadows that had swallowed Fieri. We're moving, he commanded, the tension in his voice betraying a reality far grimmer than his words. This was no tactical retreat, but a desperate flight against the clock. While Matteo covered their withdrawal, Izzy helped Marga. Lorenzo moved on his own, but the spreading stain on his shoulder told of the body's heavy toll. Bellini followed, a font of broken, weeping apologies. Fear had narrowed his world to a single imperative: follow where Lorenzo's people led. At the service dock, a boat waited, its presence a testament to Matteo's foresight before the first shot was fired. As the vessel moved toward a new refuge near Dorsa Duro, the silence on board became a crushing weight. Marga was a small shape under a blanket, her wrists raw, her face a mask of shock. Bellini was trapped in a loop, whispering, "I didn't know, I didn't know." Matteo's voice, a soft menace, finally cut in, promising restraint if he heard the phrase again. The whispering stopped. Izzy tended to Lorenzo, her hands pressing firmly to the wound through the jacket he refused to shed. The bullet had torn clean through his upper shoulder, a simple passage that still bled, a shocking testament to his mortality. His face became a stoic mask the defensemen raise against pain when they are not alone. "Keep pressure," he ordered. "I am. You're trembling. You've been shot twice in less than 24 hours. My hands are not at their most elegant." Her reply nearly broke his composure. Almost. At the new safe house, a small, fortified apartment near the university with a locked courtyard, Dr. Reva was waiting for them. The doctor asked nothing about the fresh wound laid over the old. She simply slit his sleeve, addressed the shoulder, and gave a cold ultimatum. Try to leave within the hour, and he would be sedated and bound. "I believe you," he yielded. "You should." Izzy watched Marga drink sweetened tea as Bellini sweated in a corner. Matteo unpacked the recovered bag with a detective's precision, laying out its contents: a set of keys, burner phones, receipts, 2 access badges to Belladonna Hall, and a brass token stamped with a crown lion. The ledger, however, was gone. Fieri was gone, and he had the evidence. That truth hung in the room like a threat until Marga's voice sliced through the quiet. "The ledger is not the only version." All eyes snapped to her. She took a ragged breath. "Not a physical copy, a transfer. Tonight's donor list is encoded into the numbered masks for the hall." Izzy's confusion was plain. What is that supposed to mean? Marga met her gaze. "The gala uses private masks every year, yes? Fitted by hand, numbered, catalogued. The wealthy love the theater of it. They show an invitation, a steward fetches their mask. This year, Fieri built another system on top of it. Sewn into the linings of certain masks are number sequences. They look like inventory codes, but they are identifiers for the donor files." A strangled sound escaped Bellini. "Madonna." Matteo's focus sharpened. "And the black ledger is the cipher." Marga confirmed the masks held coded data. The book translates it into names, blood types, medical records, locations, emergency contacts, the entire profile. Izzy's conclusion was stark. "You're saying they made a charity ball into a marketplace for donors." The accusation hung in the air, undisputed. Lorenzo, pinned by Dr. Reba's work, watched Marga with unnerving stillness. "How do you know this?" Marga's throat worked. "Because a lab tech got drunk and boasted about it. He said the rich loved acting like patrons of life while they shopped for it in private. I thought he was just a disgusting braggart. Then I saw a list. The night you were brought in, I saw the clean donor file was taken from storage hours before the attack. Then I understood." Dr. Reva, finished with Lorenzo's dressing, stood up. "If that transfer occurs tonight, they can burn the records tomorrow and still move those names for months." Lorenzo's curt nod sealed his decision. "Which means we end it tonight." Izzy read his intent and met it with a firm denial. "No," she said. He ignored her, turning to Matteo. "We get inside before it starts. We get the ledger, the masks, and Fieri if we can. His finance head too if she's on site." Bellini startled. "Claudia Fieri. She oversees all patron assignments. She knows the numbering." "Good," Matteo said flatly. Now we have one more name. Bellini looked physically ill. Izzy stepped into Lorenzo's line of sight. You will not do this without me. Lorenzo's jaw hardened. Wrong. Belladonna Hall is Bellini's territory. I'm known by half the staff. I fitted 3 of the guest cloaks. I know the backstage better than Matteo, and I probably know it better than you. I will learn. You'll bleed on the polished marble and ruin the affair. Her retort was like a whip crack. That isn't the same thing. Matteo barely suppressed a flicker of amusement. Lorenzo got to his feet, ignoring Dr. Reva's sharp look. The movement was clearly agonizing. Listen to me very closely, Isabella. Her full name was a tool he used, either to create a chasm of distance or to signal the breaking of a storm. You were hunted from your home, made into a bargaining chip, shot at, and dragged into this mire because you decided to help me. I am not taking you into Belladonna Hall if there is any other way. She looked him in the eye, unflinching. There is no other way. A heavy silence descended, in which Dr. Rava packed her things and quietly exited the argument. Lorenzo's stare seemed to erase the rest of the room. His voice, when he finally used it, was low. At the hospital, he said, when they told me I had a donor, I asked who. I needed to know why I was alive. Then Marga showed me the bag. A flush of heat crept up Izzy's neck. No more, he said gently. She swallowed. It was a stupid thing to do. No, his gaze held fast. It was the first act of grace I had experienced in a very long time. He spoke again before she could, his words reaching her through the sudden pressure in her chest. That is why I went to your door myself, not from obligation or some debt of gratitude. I went because I knew if someone had enough soul to write that for a stranger, then my world would devour her whole if I was too late. The room became still. Even Matteo was openly watching. Izzy's response was a whisper. You barely knew me. I still barely know you. That is not reassuring. A faint, tired smile touched his mouth. No. Her eyes fell to the new bandage on his shoulder, and the one hidden beneath his shirt. The pain he tried to hide was obvious. Stop deciding which dangers I am allowed to face. Her challenge changed something in him. It was not a softening, but a deep, unfeigned reluctance. It was the look of a man seeing the uselessness of force against an emotional truth that power cannot command. You believe this is about my ego, he said. To some degree, is it not? His answer came without hesitation. Mostly, this is about the outcome. Going with me to Belladonna Hall will sever all ties to your old life. A dark laugh almost broke from her. My former life was over at dawn. The words hit him. A flash of pure regret made him look boyish for a moment, which only served to make him seem more dangerous. Matteo's voice was a mercy, pulling them back to tactics. We are losing time. She has to go in as staff, not a guest. It offers less scrutiny and more movement. Bellini will arrange her credentials without raising flags. Bellini, startled, asked, Me? Yes, Matteo confirmed. You have a significant karmic debt. It is time to start paying. Bellini's silent plea to Lorenzo was cut off by a sharp order. Do what he says. Bellini gave a quick, pained nod of compliance. A working plan was then quickly built. Bellini would enter through the front with 2 aides, Izzy and Matteo in a servant's uniform. Bellini added, his voice trembling slightly, The help is functionally invisible unless they cause a scene. Lorenzo planned to slip in later, behind a mask, banking on Beery, expecting him to be either absent or impulsive. but never cautious. Margia and Dr. Rava would stay behind the apartment. Gio, who had been moved during the chaos, protested briefly before admitting his own physical state made him a liability. In the room Bellini was using to calm his nerves, Izzy began to prepare. Her goal was not to create an accessory for a dangerous man, but a functional disguise. Using items from Bellini's emergency supply kits, Izzy started to build herself a new face. She was costumed for the part. Severe black trousers, a cream silk blouse, and a simple dark jacket, her hair pulled back like a technician's. The effect was intentional anonymity, a ghost designed for function. When she re-entered, relief washed over Bellini. Matteo offered a nod of assent, but Lorenzo's eyes were different, possessive, appraising, just as they were the first time. "You will suffice," he stated. An eyebrow arched. It was the closest he came to praise. An appraisal of a tool, of course. Bellini straightened a cuff, whispering, "No improvisation unless absolutely necessary." "Ironic from you. I find my honesty in crisis." Matteo glanced at his watch. "We leave in 8 minutes." The tension in the room coiled into a singular focus. Bellini collected the credentials. Matteo checked a concealed weapon. Izzy slipped the brass token, a possible key, into her pocket. By the window, Lorenzo moved with a stiff, measured grace, fastening a cuff over a fresh bandage. While the others spoke in the hall, his low voice found Izzy. "If this collapses, your only order is to get out." Her answer was a silent shake of her head. "No." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Izzy." She closed the space between them, her own voice a whisper. "Don't play the noble martyr now. The part doesn't suit you." A dangerous heat flared for an instant in his eyes. "You think you know me? I know what you are not." Silence stretched taut between them. Then, slowly enough for her to pull away, he reached out. 2 fingers brushed the inside of her wrist, directly over the ghost of a wound. The slight touch sent a tremor through her. "My death," he whispered, "would have kept your life simple." Her gaze never wavered. "Maybe, but it would have cost me you, and that is a price I'm no longer willing to pay." He inhaled sharply, a sound like a rib cracking from within. Matteo appeared at the door, shattering the moment. "Apologies for interrupting whatever this is. The car is ready." Izzy stepped back first. Lorenzo's hand fell to his side as they moved toward Belladonna Hall. It was a place where masks, money, and murder were currency for men who saw souls as assets. For Izzy, this was a world she had only ever served, a place of backstairs and delivery bays. She knew the palace's guts, but had never seen the beautiful lie Venice's powerful sold from its gilded rooms. The palazzo was a stage, lit for drama. Music bled from stone corridors as servants in livery moved like ghosts among the masked. Gold candlelight trembled in niches. Practiced laughter echoed off marble. Beneath the sheen, favors were being traded like stocks. Bellini moved forward on a current of brittle confidence, nodding to the chief steward before unleashing a torrent of grievances. His performance was perfect because it was real. Izzy saw it then. His most potent weapon was the marriage of his professional outrage and his raw terror. A pace back, Matteo wore the blank expression of expensive security, a garment bag held in one hand. Izzy played the dutiful assistant, eyes fixed on her clipboard. They passed through the crowds like air, unseen and unnoted. This, Izzy realized, was how the rot set in. The powerful never see the people who serve them. In the antechamber for the private masks, they found the first piece. 42 cases lined in velvet, each marked with a patron's code. The masks inside ranged from lacquered demons to feathered angels, some dripping with jewels. With Bellini's escalating argument as her cover, Izzy examined the collection. Hidden in the lining of every sixth mask, a tiny sequence of numbers was stitched in silver thread. Marja had been right. Izzy betrayed nothing as she continued down the line, but her stomach tightened when she saw the empty space where the leather ledger should have been. Instead, Claudia Very stood there, speaking softly with two men in formal wear. Younger than expected, perhaps 35, she radiated a severe grace, wearing no ornament but a single perfect diamond. If Very was the charitable face, Claudia was the ruthless engine of profit that drove it. Finishing her conversation, she moved toward the display. Izzy instantly became absorbed in a piece of fabric. Claudia's gaze passed over her without recognition, landing on Bellini, whose fear was sublimating into theatrical fury. "Signora Very," he announced, "I cannot be responsible for the finish if your people continue to manhandle the pieces." Her smile was carved from ice. "Luckily, Signor Bellini, you are paid for artistry, not insurance." His authentic indignation, a perfect diversion, hung in the air as she walked away. The moment she vanished past the archway, Matteo murmured the target. Rear chamber, left passage. Izzy nodded once. Bellini's continued tirade created a wall of sound, a perfect screen for Matteo to trail Claudia, moving with the practiced invisibility of a servant. After a deliberate 3-second delay, Izzy picked up a tray of pins and followed. The hallway branched away from the grand ballroom, leading to private salons, rooms built for quiet deals and protected sin. A lone guard in a tuxedo stood watch before a black lacquered door. He was not house security. He was something quieter, more lethal. Matteo went in first, mentioning adjustments for patron 27, and was waved through after a brief glance. 10 seconds passed. Izzy approached with her tray, murmuring about a request from Signora Very for new fasteners. The guard's boredom was a tangible thing as he let her pass. Inside, beauty masked corruption. Under a frescoed ceiling, the missing ledger lay open on a long table surrounded by 3 mask cases, 2 laptops, and stacks of client files tied with black silk. Very stood near the fireplace, his features hidden by an ornate mask, speaking with Claudia and a gray-haired man identified as a medical foundation director. 2 others were examining the inside of a mask with a surgeon's focus. A cold knot formed in Izzy's stomach. This was not symbolism, but commerce. Claudia's eyes found her first. "What is that?" Izzy held out the tray. "Replacement hooks, Signora, requested 10 minutes ago. I came as fast as they allowed." Claudia's stare sharpened. "Who sent you?" Before Izzy could invent a name, a new voice answered. "I did, Lorenzo." He stepped from the opposite door, wearing a dark coat and a simple black mask, carrying himself like a man who owned the room. But the calm was a facade. Every movement was deliberate, his body held unnaturally still. Though hidden, Izzy could feel the pull of the new bandage beneath his shirt. Vieri turned. "Enzo," he said, his voice slick with false warmth. "I wondered if it would be the hammer or the scalpel. Of course you'd bring one disguised as the other." Lorenzo slowly pulled off his gloves. "You sold hospital data. You sold patient files." Vieri waved a hand. "I created a market. The city was for sale long before I arrived." The foundation director began to fidget. Claudia turned to stone. "You shouldn't have come here hurt." Lorenzo's gaze never left Vieri. "And you shouldn't mistake a wound for a weakness." Everything that followed happened at once. A war fought on 2 fronts. On the surface were the words Vieri, speaking of private clients, Lorenzo demanding he name them, Claudia hiding behind medical discretion, the director trying to vanish into the wallpaper. But just below the surface, another war was brewing, one of imminent, brutal violence. Matteo shifted, covering the exit. Izzy edged closer to the table. Outside, the guard's bored slump straightened into readiness. The masks on display seemed like articles of damnation. A slight smile touched Vieri's lips. You, more than anyone, understand supply and demand. You understand loyalty as an asset. I understand lines, Lorenzo shot back. And here you are, pretending you still have some. The words landed with physical force. For the first time, Izzy saw Lorenzo's anger stripped bare of its control. Not louder, not wilder, but pathologically pure. You use public hospitals, he said, his voice dropping. You sold donor histories. You put guns in a blood bank and called it efficiency. Vieri's smile vanished. And you rule your half of the city with a fist and call it structure? Spare me the moralistic performance. Lorenzo's mention of a line finally clicked for Izzy. Men like him were titans, powerful enough to bend a city's very soul to their whim. But Vieri had crossed into territory Lorenzo regarded with pure revulsion. This wasn't simple theft or graft. It was the act of preying on human despair for profit. That was the line. As Claudia reached for the ledger, Izzy moved. The service tray shot across the table in a clatter of metal and scattering pins. The ledger skated toward the edge just as Matteo burst through the door. All civility in the room evaporated. The hall guard stormed in, firearm raised. Matteo met him at the doorframe, a wall of force. Claudia's hand snatched at a donor file, her fingers closing on nothing but paper. The director of the foundation recoiled, cursing under his breath. Vieri dove for the ledger, but Lorenzo moved faster. Their bodies collided with the table, the impact sending a lamp crashing to the floor. Izzy clutched the book. It felt heavy with secrets, names, and coded data. A laptop skidded across the rug. Claudia came at her with a raw fury, no longer an executive, but a woman staring into the abyss of her own ruin. Izzy instinctively drove her shoulder forward. Claudia stumbled back. Matteo shouted an order. Lorenzo and Vieri slammed against the fireplace mantel. A gunshot exploded behind her, the sound deafening in the enclosed room. The ballroom doors were flung open. The music died. A chorus of alarm rose from its guests. Masked faces turned toward the suite as Bellini performed the single bravest act of his life. He screamed, not with finesse, but with the raw power of a man who had chosen to turn terror into a weapon. "Fire!" His voice tore through the hall. "Fire in the patron suites!" The resulting chaos was immediate and absolute. The orderly world outside shattered, and guests began to stampede. A footman bolted. A shrill emergency bell began to ring. Shouts for water, for police, for medics filled the air. In that instant, the private war became a public spectacle, the one thing Vieri could not afford. Realizing this, Claudia lunged again, not for Izzy, but for the ornate masks nearby. In a split second, Izzy made a gambler's choice. She tore the lining from a mask and flung the silver-coated band out into the hallway. It glittered in the chandelier light for the fleeing crowd to see. She did it twice more. Coded secrets were now on public display. "What are you doing?" Claudia shrieked. "Ending your privacy," Izzy retorted. By now, Matteo had the foundation director and the guard under control. Bellini's cries echoed down the corridor, which was now filled with onlookers. Near the fireplace, Lorenzo and Vieri were locked in a savage, graceless struggle. This was not a fight for dominance, but for annihilation. Vieri's hand scrambled for a fallen pistol. Izzy saw it. Enzo! At her voice, Lorenzo twisted, smashing Vieri's wrist down on the stone hearth. The gun fired into the floor. Matteo crossed the space in 2 strides and kicked the weapon away. The fight was over, not cleanly, but completely. A minute later, the situation was beyond salvage. Police were in the hall, and guests were shouting about smoke and assault. Claudia was restrained while babbling a ludicrous story about the files being for philanthropic emergencies. The director was pale and silent. Vieri, his composure intact despite a bleeding lip, said nothing as Lorenzo loomed over him. The ledger lay open between them like a final judgment. When a policeman demanded to know who was in charge, 5 different people answered at once. Bellini was one of them. 2 hours later, Venice's sky bled from black to a soft, pre-dawn gray. Hasty statements were taken. Lawyers materialized. Names too powerful to bury were already moving through official channels. The evidence, donor files, masks, laptop, and the ledger, was secured before Vieri's influence could make it disappear. Margia's statement would be the final nail. Standing in the landing, Izzy clutched her coat as an aftershock of adrenaline trembled through her. Lorenzo appeared moments later, his mask gone. He looked exhausted, older, and somehow more real. A smear of dried blood stained his cuff. Under his torn jacket, his shoulder was bandaged. A bruise on his temple had deepened, but his eyes were sharp. Silence stretched between them. "You threw the masks into the hall, Leosur," he finally said. It was impulsive. "Yes." A faint, weary smile touched his lips, and it was definitive. She looked away. "I couldn't see another option to make it too public to hide. You saw the only one." Another pause, heavy but not tense. He closed the space between them, giving her every chance to back away. "I told you simplicity was over," he said softly. "It is. And I said I came so my world wouldn't destroy you." Her gaze met his. It didn't. "No," he murmured, his voice low. "You wouldn't let it." A pang of warmth filled her chest at the respect in his voice, devoid of any ownership. "What happens now?" she asked. "Vieri is neutralized. Claudia will either cooperate or face the consequences. Bellini is now a valuable state witness. Marzia is protected. Your father will be moved to a safe location tonight." "And you?" He hesitated. "Me?" A subtle change crossed his face. "You decide if this is where I leave." It would have been easier if he had demanded, if he had assumed, if the monster she'd been warned about had finally appeared. But he just stood there, wounded, deadly, and profoundly respectful of her choice. She thought of the hospital, the blood, the note, her father, the warehouse, the ledger, realizing that Lorenzo Reacci's greatest power was not in the control he wielded, but in the control he chose to give away. "I don't think you get to just walk away from this," she said. That tired smile returned. "No." He took the last step toward her. "Isabella." "Izzy," she corrected, her voice gentle. His eyes held an emotion she knew she could never trust, but would always want. "Izzy. If I stay, everything is on the table. No debts, no claims, no thanks required." She swallowed. "And you don't get to decide which fights are mine to face." The male's acquiescence triggered a vocal release from the female, a sound that broke the event's acute tension. His subsequent approach was deliberate, a clear test of her consent boundary, which was met with no resistance. This passivity, logged as acceptance, led to physical contact that presented not as conquest, but as a biological reaffirmation of survival after 2 life-threatening encounters. A cognitive reprioritization of existence is observed. After contact, the Venetian setting offered a deceptive veneer of normalcy. The subject, Isabella Moretti, a classic example of socioeconomic vulnerability, had begun her day expecting a predictable threat. She instead faced a convergence of stimuli, mortal danger, bodily harm, and a paradigm-shifting revelation, all linked to a male whose containment strategy had critically failed. The violent rerouting of her life's course was not achieved through direct force. The primary diagnostic clue is her decision to stay after all constraints were removed. This choice is a textbook symptom of traumatic bonding or Stockholm syndrome, wherein the subject psychologically reframes a coercive ordeal as a consensual bond.
Lesson: violence does not begin with bullets, it begins when human beings are reduced to resources. From a distance, Isabella and Lorenzo appear to belong to different moral universes. She represents labor, sacrifice, and ordinary survival. He represents force, secrecy, and a system built on intimidation. Yet the story carefully dismantles that simple contrast. It shows that the real evil is not merely individual brutality, but the structure that turns vulnerability into currency. Lorenzo lives inside violence. Vieri industrializes it. That distinction matters. The deeper horror of the story is not the shooting, nor even the abduction attempt. It is the donor list, the cataloging of rare blood types, the private circulation of medical data among elites disguised as philanthropists. This is where the narrative becomes larger than mafia fiction. It becomes a meditation on what happens when society stops seeing people as human beings and starts seeing them as inventories of value. Isabella donates blood because she understands blood as solidarity. She remembers her father waiting for transfusion after a stroke. To her, blood means time, mercy, survival. But in the hands of corrupt networks, blood becomes leverage, status, priority access. The same substance that signifies shared humanity is transformed into a luxury commodity. That transformation is the true moral wound of the story. And Lorenzo, for all his darkness, is shaken precisely because he recognizes that line has been crossed. He may control fear, but Vieri monetizes helplessness. He takes sickness, desperation, and mortality and wraps them in gala masks and charitable language. In other words, he aestheticizes cruelty. He makes exploitation look refined. That is why Lorenzo's rage feels different here. It is not simply territorial, it is existential. He is staring at a version of power that has become so polished it no longer needs to admit it is monstrous. Isabella becomes the narrative's conscience because she never stops reacting like a human being. She does not normalize the horror. She does not become numb fast enough, and that refusal to be numbed is its own kind of resistance. This leads to the story's central life lesson. Evil becomes strongest when it convinces people that dehumanization is practical. The donor auction works because too many people accept the logic beneath it. The rich need options, hospitals leak, data circulates. People in pain become systems to manage. Step by step, morality is replaced by efficiency. The atrocity is not born in one dramatic instant. It is assembled through rationalizations. That is why Isabella matters. Her presence interrupts that logic. She gives without calculating gain. She speaks when silence would be safer. She tears open the mask linings and forces the hidden mechanism into public view. Symbolically, that act is brilliant. She destroys secrecy not by defeating power physically, but by making it visible. What corruption requires most is concealment. Once exposed, it starts to lose its elegance. The story suggests that cycles of violence do not only continue through revenge, they continue through abstraction. The moment people become files, codes, donors, assets, or clean lists, conscience weakens. To resist that process, someone must insist on personhood. Isabella does. Lorenzo unexpectedly begins to. So the lesson is not merely be kind, it is more demanding than that. Refuse every system that asks you to stop seeing the human cost. Once a society begins ranking lives by usefulness, access, and purchase power, brutality no longer arrives wearing a weapon. It arrives wearing a tuxedo.